Hello, and welcome to the third episode all about women and the First World War. My name is Gabrielle McMaster. I am an author and historian. Within today's episode, we are going to be looking at what happened when the men went to fight and the women were left at home. In today's episode, we are going to be focusing on the VADs, the canaries, and the women on the home front. Before we begin, it's very important to realise that something similar happened throughout history in terms of women taking over from men. The prime example of this was in the 14th century with the Black Death. Women took over from men as heirs to estates, lands and properties when the male population within the family died. As I'm sure you can tell, this whole change of women taking the role of men was due to the lack of population, and this is exactly what happened during the First World War as well. The male population was not there for them to take on these roles of factory work and land work, so it was up to the women to take over and do the jobs that men were no longer here to do. So we're going to start off with looking at the canaries. These are women who worked in munitions factories. Women who worked in these factories usually had dependents at home, or they couldn't move away from their own home life. They also thought that the munitions work was far less dangerous than the other jobs at the time, such as nursing or the home front. However, it was actually quite the opposite once they got into the workplace. So these women were working with very dangerous chemicals which were explosive and sometimes even toxic to them. Due to this, over 300 women are estimated to have lost their lives in explosions in these factories in Belfast alone. The chemicals which the women breathed in went into their blood and clung to their blood cells. At the time, women didn't realise that this is what was happening to them until they started to see physical changes. These included having their skin tinted yellow, having lung problems, their hair falling out, or their hair being tinged orange. Women who were also pregnant at the time may have given birth to a baby who had bright yellow skin. Due to the bright yellow skin being caused by the chemicals, and of course the love of women singing in these factories, they were dubbed the canaries. And these women sacrificed a lot of their own lives and health to do this job and to make sure that men on the front lines actually had the munitions to fight against the enemy. The next one we're going to look at are the VADs and the nurses. So the VADs are known as voluntary aid detachments. These were people without any nursing backgrounds. Men could have also become VADs, but they became VADs as ambulance drivers. Two of the most famous VADs at the time were Vera Brittain and Agatha Christie. The women who signed up as VADs had to complete 2 certificates before entering into any hospital. These were their home nursing certificate and their first aid certificate. Once the women got into hospitals, they were on 12-hour shifts. This was usually from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, or of course 8 at night until 8 in the morning. In 1915, the VADs and the nurses got the chance to go to hospitals over in France and Belgium. However, what they did not realise until they got there was that they may have been given the task of looking after enemy soldiers, and they were told they had to treat them as neutrally as they possibly could. The toughest job that came with this was that they opened themselves up to a lot of injuries that newspapers were not discussing at the time. In 1915, when gas was first used by the Germans, the newspapers started to report that men were recovering quickly and easily from it. However, this was not what women were seeing in the hospitals. They were seeing men who were permanently or temporarily blinded by gas, and of course men who had issues with their lungs. One of the issues that women were also coming into contact with was the shell shock. Shell shock had been seen in men before the First World War, and that's quite often a misconception with the First World War, that this was the first time anyone had ever seen psychological effects to do with war. It was present within the Boer War, but it got the name shell shock simply because people had never seen an effect like this before. It was far more traumatic for the men this war than any previous, and they thought it was due to the noise of the shells that actually set off this nervous disposition within them. At the time, shell shock was very much misunderstood, and officers who had shell shock were taken far more seriously than the ordinary soldiers who also had it. Shell shock hospitals did start to form, however, their methods of dealing with shell shock were a lot to be desired, with one of the methods being violent shaking until the men themselves stopped shaking. Nurses also open themselves up to men injuring themselves, and this is a phenomenon which a lot of people do know about, that men did injure themselves to stop themselves from having to go to the front lines to fight. Once the men were caught by their commanding officer for doing this, they then had to come up with some other way of getting out of fighting on the front lines for the set length. One of the ways that they did come up with was to contract a sexually transmitted disease. The men purposefully, when on leave, went to brothels in France or Belgium that were known to have women in it who had STDs. Their symptoms would have showed up in about 3 to 5 days later, and then they would have been in a hospital for an entire month. However, men did get very inventive with this, and if the men were sitting in a trench and they didn't want to fight, what they decided to do was to give each other the STDs. And if you are a little bit squeamish, you may not want to listen to this next bit. Men decided to give themselves STDs by going to their friend who may have had one, and he got his friend to push the pus out of his urethra, and with the end of a matchstick he scraped the pus and handed it to his friend, and his friend would have wiped the pus on his own urethra. And within 3 to 5 days, the two of them would have ended up in hospital together for a month. Many men on their medical records did have several STDs listed, and in fact, sometimes they had all 3 main ones listed on it, and it just shows the lengths that these men would have actually gone to get out of fighting. The fighting was so traumatic compared with the romanticised image that these men originally did have of the war. When the Somme happened, hospitals that were nearest to the coast of England ended up getting the worst injured. This was due to the fact that they didn't know whether the men would have survived had they taken them further afield. So those immediately on the coast, such as Poole, were given the men worst injured from the Somme that were able to get home to a hospital there. This is a war that is an artillery war. This means that shrapnel shells were used more than bullets, and in fact 58% of men died from shrapnel wounds. For us to think of how many shells were fired, in the entire war 1.7 million shells were fired on all fronts. Now, throughout 4 years, this seems like a very big number to try and wrap our heads around. So, to put it into terms that we could probably imagine, it roughly amounts to 3 shells fired per single second in the war on all fronts. And that number is absolutely massive. And you can understand where this trauma came from for a lot of the men. And in fact, the men, especially the young men, relied on nurses to give them that bit of home comfort that they didn't have the minute they entered the war. A lot of the young men were injured and homesick, scared and shell-shocked. And the nurses just gave them that little bit of home comfort and that company that they never really had, and that reminded them so much of home as well. So nurses were so vital in this regard. Now, it must be remembered that some VADs and nurses did lose their life through the bombing of hospitals on the Western and Eastern fronts. Finally, we of course come to the home front and the Women's Land Army. Days after the outbreak of the war, the government made a call for women to join up and help in the fields, but no one took them up on this. And in fact, it took them 3 years until 1917 for women to go into the fields, start farming and helping out with food production. This was known as the 1917 Land Army. It is actually known today as the forgotten 1917's Land Army because no one seems to remember the sacrifices women made on the farming front during the First World War. The British diet did not change much during the First World War, especially coming towards the end of it, and in fact bread was never once rationed in Britain throughout the entire war. And in 1918, the harvest was actually deemed to be one of the greatest throughout the entire First World War. While British food security did look quite precarious at the start of 1917, the women did take to the fields to save it, and they managed to make sure that vital elements of someone's diet, such as bread, was not rationed as heavily as other products. These women are very much forgotten in today's history, and I think that a lot more history needs to be given to these women and to really look into the sacrifices they made, not just with the factories and the nursing, but also in the fields on the home front, and how they actually kept Britain's diet consistent throughout the whole war. While they may not have went to the fields until 3 years after the call-up, they still helped the British war effort. I hope you enjoyed this little short history on women's efforts during the First World War. That although they themselves could not go into the army and fight, they still made their presence known throughout the entire war effort, and they really must be applauded for this. If you enjoyed, please do subscribe, because we will be doing a lot more history on the First World War, the Second World War, some weird facts in history that you may not know, but also some film history as well, including the Carry On films. So thank you once again, and I hope you enjoyed.